So when you got the news, Nicola, I think it was on Friday, that the guards were going to treat the murder of Anthony Campbell as a cold case, like, it really was a very significant moment if you consider it's a full 18 years have passed, and the fight that Christine has had to find justice for her son.
So the decision has been made to review the murder investigation. So for the moment, local police will be reviewing their files to see if there's any opportunities there.
Yeah.
Now, look, in a murder case that is as old as this one, that could be in advances in DNA technology. I think during the Caught in the Crossfire podcast, Brian Sherry told us that there wasn't actually that much DNA garnered from the house where Anthony Campbell was killed. But there could be all sorts of other witness statements or anything so what they'll do is the local police will go through all that, and then they hand it back to the Serious Crime Review team, and at that point it will be decided whether a full cold case review is handled. So it's a sort of in a place where it is almost a full cold case review. It is very likely that it's going to become that, and Anthony Campbell's mother is very hopeful, that's Christine Campbell, that she may finally get, even in her words, that she finally feels she's done all she can for him, because for the last few years she's been in a bit of no man's land. She has called for reviews before and she hasn't heard back, and it hasn't gone anywhere. But it seems that since her own voice was heard in the podcast, perhaps the police, I think, are probably saying to her that they were considering this anyway. It's nothing to do with any podcast. But I think anybody who listened to the podcast and heard her pleas for people to do anything they could to get justice for her son, you'd find it hard to turn your back on her, wouldn't you?
You would. And what would the police be looking for? Like, what would the local guards would they be looking through? I mean, we can only suppose, but presumably they'd be looking through whatever witness statements exist, that sort of thing, to see if there's some of them that could be followed up in a different way.
I presume so. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know, because I have never obviously seen the file on it. I did speak at length with Brian Sherry, who was the senior investigating officer at the time, and he talks about an investigation that was very robustly carried out, that he would stand by at this point. What I would always have had to wonder about this case was, this is Marlow Highland. This is what we were told at the time, the most significant gangland player in the entire Irish underworld at the time. He was a guy who was under threat from his own. He'd been issued with Jim forms, Garda information messages to say his life was under threat. He had been sort of responsible, it was believed, for a flurry of murders himself as he became increasingly paranoid. And he was responsible for bringing in the bulk of cocaine into the country at the time. Was he not under surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, presumably he was under surveillance.
So, that's maybe the kind of thing that could be looked at now, because obviously surveillance within the Gardaí would be held very tightly. Perhaps there would have been reasons back then that if he was under surveillance, that any of the intelligence or detail found then that the police, the Gardaí, maybe felt they weren't in a position to hand that over to local officers. But has that changed now?
Yeah. I mean, obviously the murder occurred in December 2006. I mean, at that stage, mobile phone surveillance would have been pretty routine. Obviously, how Anthony Campbell was killed was that Marlow Highland was staying in the home of a relative. Two gunmen burst into that home where Anthony Campbell was carrying out a job, I think fixing a radiator at the time. One of the gunmen at least, went upstairs and shot Marlow Highland dead in bed, and before they left they shot Anthony Campbell as well. So we know at least they then were taken away in a getaway car, and then it's believed that getaway car was met by another car and burnt out, and a fourth man. So we have a getaway driver, a fourth getaway driver, and the two men. So we know it's four suspects, really, isn't it?
One of which is the murdered Eamon the Don Dunn, who of course went on to sort of take over Marlow Highland's network and was believed to have been one of the getaway drivers in, waiting outside the house. We do know, you and I, who the chief suspects are that went into the house that day. They have been named previously. Brian Sherry has identified who he believes was the actual gunman, how he believes it happened. He believes that the two gunmen went into the house. They had watched the house from outside. They knew that this plumber had arrived that morning. They watched Marlo Hyland's niece leave the house and go to school with her children. They watched the plumber come back out of the house because he had to go and get some tools, you know, the way the shop's open in the morning or whatever. But they didn't realise that he'd left young Anthony inside because they had only seen one go in.
Yeah.
That's what Brian Sherry believes as the senior investigating officer. That is the sort of the narrative of the team at the time. So when the two gunmen burst in, they believe Marlo Hyland was alone in that house on his own, asleep in an upstairs bedroom. They were sort of taken aback to find Anthony fixing a radiator. He believes one of the gunmen held him at gunpoint while the second went upstairs and shot dead the sleeping Marlo Hyland. Actually, he had, I think Brian Sherry describes him holding his scapula.
Yeah.
That he had woken.
Yeah.
He believed.
Right, okay.
But despite the fact that there was two men and gunshots in a small house.
Yeah.
And that one ran upstairs, came back down, and he believes that the same gunman shot Anthony Campbell because Anthony may have recognised this guy, or he may have believed he was going to identify him at some stage. It was a split-second decision. But despite that movement within a small confined house, there was carpets on the stairs, there was banisters, there was handles on doors to be touched, very little DNA.
Yeah. And
that is the mark of a professional hitman, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's not one of these chaotic shootings where somebody's spraying bullets from a distance. It was, as you said, there was a surveillance operation. There was a clear plan to get away with it as well. We do know, obviously, the names of the chief suspects being the two men in particular. We know that those two men were hardened criminals who'd been involved in organised crime, were already veterans in organised crime at that stage. Obviously, Christine is, you know, she spoke to you extensively, very sort of movingly. Even all these years on, you could still feel the rawness of her grief. I think that's one of the things that really came true. How was she sort of greeted this news? Like,
yeah, I mean, she described to me. So Anthony was 20, and he was her only son and her only child, and you know, her life obviously was turned upside down after it. She had reared him in England on her own. And moved back to Ireland when that sort of, if you remember, that knife crime started to rise in London, and she became worried that he might get caught up in something, or it wasn't a great place for him to be as a young man. So she moved him back to Dublin because she felt it was a safer place for him to grow up. He was doing well, you know. Had gotten a job as an apprentice plumber, had been let go, and had got this one just before Christmas, which he was delighted with because he was going to have a few bob to buy Christmas presents. So after he was shot dead, I don't think any of us who haven't lost a child, and especially in violent circumstances, can begin to imagine what it was like. But suffice to say that she ended up going back to England.
Yeah.
She, you know, had to try and forge something for herself. And she's in a strong relationship there. Her partner has children, and she sort of is the surrogate granny to these kids, or certainly enjoys them as if they're her own. There's not a day goes by that she doesn't think about Anthony. And she feels this horrendous guilt that parents of children who die feel.
Yeah.
And her guilt is that she hasn't done enough for him.
Yeah.
And has she shouted loud enough? Has she got all she can get? She's been trying to sort of fight against this system. I mean, bear in mind, you know, her son died in those horrendous circumstances, but he's forever linked to Marlo Hyland. I think when she wrote to the commissioner in the aftermath of doing the podcast and really sort of navel-gazing at everything in the course of doing that, she posed the question, you know, should her son's murder be linked to Marlo Hyland?
Yeah.
Are they two separate murders? Yes, they happened together in the one incident, but they're two separate murder victims.
Yeah.
And should a review of her son's murder rely on the Gardaí having to launch a review of the murder of Marlo Hyland? Are both lives as valuable? Were they both as, you know, is there calls for Martin Marlowe Hyland's murder to be solved? There hasn't been. Yet does that mean that her son has to forever be immortalised with him, and Anthony as an innocent victim, is he not entitled to a cold case review?
Look, I mean, we get this all the time. People complain. Obviously, there's, Anthony Campbell is not alone. There's been many other, I suppose, people shot in cases of mistaken identity. They're sometimes described as gangland killings because obviously they're carried out by gangland figures in the course of, carrying out their career as gangsters. But often you have the family really find that difficult because there is that association. No matter the fact that the paper will always say these were totally innocent people, mistaken identity.
And Christine in particular didn't like that whole phrase of wrong place, wrong time.
Yeah.
He wasn't doing anything wrong.
Exactly.
There was nothing wrong. He was gone to work. He was doing an innocent day's work. And you came up actually with the title of the podcast, Caught in the Crossfire, which sort of suited everybody in as much as you could be respectful to everybody, and particularly Christine as Anthony's mother.
Yeah, and I mean, look, that's just
what it was. He was caught in a gangland crossfire.
He was caught, and unfortunately it just happens all the time, not just in Ireland, but there've been so many cases of it across the world, but in Ireland as well. When I think back to all of the years, children, innocent people, gunned down, and that's one of the sort of forgotten things that we don't speak about as much, in a way that they're always they're an inevitability. Innocent people are going to suffer, not just because family members are killed, but because of the nature of how gangland hits are carried out.
Yeah.
So
Christine Campbell was contacted by the police in recent days, really, and she was told that the local investigators had actually met with the Garda Serious Crime Review team. Now, that's the biggest thing that's happened for her in this investigation for a long time. I'll just quote you what she said to me in relation to that. She said, Anthony was killed in December 2006, and not a day has gone by since that I haven't been consumed by it. I cannot explain to me what it means to know that Garda are reviewing his case, that perhaps there's finally hope that I will get justice for my son. When I was informed this week that members of the local investigation team had met with senior management at the Garda Serious Crime Review team, I was overwhelmed. It means so much to know that Anthony has not been forgotten and that there are fresh efforts to investigate his murder.
Yeah.
And that's very, very little for her to ask or to be grateful for. But I can totally see where she's coming from, because she feels, and as I say, she hopes that a full cold case review will be extended and will be announced, and perhaps there will be some appeals done around this, public appeals done around this going forward. But I think she feels that she's given her child something, or she's done something for her child.
I mean, if you think back to those string of murders committed by Marlowe Hyland and ordered then by his successor, Eamon de Don, there was such a low success rate, really, wasn't there, in solving them? There was so many of them that just given the nature of the time, as you said, the lack of DNA evidence, maybe the lack of CCTV evidence.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that there was so many of them. I mean, back in, I think, around that part of the 2000s, there was, 20 more murders a year at least, wasn't there? And many of them were concentrated in that part of Finglas. It was a really, really brutal time in gangland in Dublin, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And, they were very, I suppose, gangland and those murders go through peaks and troughs.
They do.
Don't they?
Yeah.
All along. There's these explosions of violence caused by feuds. If you reverse back a little bit, actually, Garda crackdowns, which is what happened Marlowe, sort of create this element of paranoia and almost creates the atmosphere for feuds to develop, because one guy's accusing another one on ratting, or somebody has had to give up the drugs, or somebody, and the likelihood is there probably is intelligence.
Yeah.
And again, is there intelligence buried somewhere within the Garda organisation that is relatable today and could be used in cases going forward against any of these people that were involved in it? Because there's 3 alive that were, some of them with serious criminal history and pedigree. Is there anything that has been lying in the surveillance units that could be of help now to the investigating officers?
Yeah, and of course then the other reality is there was, 4 people directly involved in carrying out this murder. But again, as we've seen with these sort of maybe some of the more recent Kinahan murders that have been solved, you see there's a whole logistics level as well, past the actual form that were maybe driving cars or in the cars. So there will be other people that heard or knew stuff.
And there won't be this, while there's, it can help getting members of the public to come forward. And Brian Sherry did say that nobody came forward with everybody was so terrified at the time because of what you pointed out was the level of murder that was happening, the violence of the successor that was coming up underneath them. But if you recall, the Regency trial, which gave us such an eye-opener into investigation techniques and what was going on under the surface. Stuff that you don't really hear about day to day. But if you recall that, you had the team out in Ballymun, wasn't it Ballymun?
Ballymun,
they were investigating the murder of David Byrne in the Regency Hotel, who was murdered with these Kalashnikov weapons, which had been obviously, we don't know where they actually originated from ever, but there was a plan to later give them back up to the north to the paramilitaries. And if you recall that there was a surveillance operation put on Shane Rowan, and in which Patsy Hutch, the monk's brother, was caught on camera under surveillance. The cars were being watched moving in and out. And later in that day, those weapons were found in the back of Shane Rowan's vehicle on its way back up north towards Donegal. But the Ballymun team who were investigating David Byrne's murder were not privy to that.
No, it's bizarre.
They were all the while spending countless hours going through CCTV to try and watch cars passing particular and to route them around the city. Yeah,
and exactly. And that intelligence was sitting there somewhere. The guns were seized from Shane Rowan. It wasn't a routine traffic stop and they found the guns. They knew exactly what was happening because they had electronic surveillance.
And warrants for that surveillance.
Exactly. So this will be an issue that has bedeviled the Gardaí and probably international police forces as well. The belief that certainly some sorts of intelligence are more important to know, but you can't reveal it even within the organisation because then you can no longer gather that type of intelligence. Certainly by the 2006 Garda technology was ahead of mobile phone technology, and mobile phones were certainly being used by Marlow Island's gang on a constant basis. The guards absolutely had extremely good evidence because you can see with the level of drug seizures against that gang, it's never particularly said how they knew it, but they seem to have known.
It's not luck, is it?
It's not luck. No. It's not routine traffic stops, as I said, or following people. No doubt that was a part of it. So there may well be that information there, and it is of course possible. But hopefully the passage of time can make a difference in that way.
Yeah, hopefully. And anybody who wants to listen to the podcast Caught in the Crossfire, it's wherever you get your podcasts. It's produced by Crime World. It features interviews with Christine Campbell, with Christy Mangan, the former head of the Garda's serious crime review team, which is also known as the cold case team. He describes how he believes that it is a murder that should be reviewed by that team and exactly how those cold case reviews work and operate and how they can be helpful in solving crimes. And obviously, in a very emotional interview, Brian Sherry, the former senior investigating officer, Detective Inspector Brian Sherry, very popular officer, describes how that really was the case that broke him, actually. And he gives a very emotional interview about how he walked into the house that day in Scribbletown Park in Finglas and he saw Anthony Campbell, who had while 20 looked like a child lying dead under the radiator. He describes the injuries to his hand, where he'd obviously put his hand up to try and save himself as the gunman fired at him. And it's a hard listen, but at the same time, it's in largely Christine's own words.
Yeah.
And I always think that the intimacy you get when you're listening to these people, not listening to you or I, but actually these people who experienced it.
And the enduring effects is the other thing. I mean, even the enduring effects on Brian Sherry, it is quite, it really puts it in context, particularly for us journalists who become so accustomed to
for sure
the facts and figures,
And like it was a difficult story to tell, because you have two totally different characters who are central to it, because they both die on that same day.
Yeah.
Martin Marlowe Hyland, this extremely violent, frightening character. And my friend Joey the Lips O'Callaghan actually came on to tell us about his encounter with them and how scary Martin Marlowe Hyland was, the power he held. And then you have this sort of innocent young man who will forever be missed by his mother, his father, and no doubt all his loved ones. So let's hope that this investigation goes that final step to the announcement of a full cold case review of the murder, and let's hope that Christine will eventually see some justice done for her son.
Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks, Niall.